at 10:47 a.m. On October 14, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Chen was cruising at 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany, when his coolant temperature gauge jumped from 100 degrees Celsius to 115 in less than 30 seconds. He was flying P-51B Silver Lady, tail number 43-21789. The Packard Merlin engine had been purring smoothly for 93 minutes. Now it was dying. Chen tapped the gauge. Maybe it was stuck. Maybe the instrument was faulty. The needle jumped again. 120 degrees. 125. The engine wasn't overheating from excess heat. It was overheating because coolant had stopped flowing. Ice had formed in the coolant passages. Solid ice at 27,000 feet, where outside air temperature was minus 46 degrees Celsius. The glycol coolant mixture that was supposed to prevent freezing had frozen anyway. Chen had two choices. Dive, immediately to warmer air below 20,000 feet, or watch his engine seize in approximately 90 seconds. Either choice meant abandoning the bomber formation he was supposed to protect. Either choice meant leaving 64 B-17 seconds exposed to German fighters. Either choice meant dead bomber crews. He chose to dive. Shoved the stick forward. Silver Lady dropped like a stone. 25,000 feet. 22,000. 18,000. Behind him and above him, he heard the radio chatter. BF-109s diving on the bomber stream, fighters at 12 o'clock high, bandits coming through. Then the sound every fighter pilot dreaded. The sound of bombers calling for help that wouldn't come. The sound of men dying because their escort had to leave. Chen leveled off at 15,000 feet. Engine temperature dropped to 110 degrees. Coolant began flowing again. The ice had melted. His engine was operational. But 24 B-17 seconds were burning above him, shot down by German fighters that attacked the moment the Mustang escort disappeared. 720 bomber crewmen. Some would bail out. Some would be captured. Most would die. Chen landed at RAF Duxford 2 hours later. Engine running smoothly, aircraft undamaged. He climbed out of the cockpit and threw up on the tarmac. Not from air sickness. From the knowledge that he'd abandoned men who trusted him to be there. Between October and December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 23 P-51B Mustangs to coolant system failures. Not shot down by German fighters. Not destroyed by flak. Lost because ice formed in coolant passages at high altitude and pilots had to choose between diving to safety or watching their engines explode. 23 aircraft. 23 pilots who came home alive but left bomber crews to die. And an unknown number of bombers lost because their fighter escort had to descend. The cruel irony was that the P-51B Mustang was supposed to be perfect. On paper, it was the fighter the 8th Air Force had been praying for since 1942. Packard Merlin V16503, engine producing 1,490 horsepower, top speed 437 miles per hour. Service ceiling 41,900 feet. But the specification that mattered most was range. The P-51B could fly 1,650 miles on internal fuel. Round trip from England to Berlin with enough fuel for combat. For the first time, American heavy bombers could have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. Before the Mustang, bomber losses had been catastrophic. Unescorted B-17 seconds flying deep into Germany faced fighter attacks the entire mission. Luftwaffe pilots knew exactly where American fighter escorts had to turn back. P-47 Thunderbolts could reach the German border. P-38 Lightnings could make it to Frankfurt on a good day. But beyond that, bombers flew alone. The results were predictable and brutal. The PA, August 1943 Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid lost 60 B-17 seconds out of 376 aircraft. 16% casualties in a single mission. 600 men dead or captured. At that rate, bomber crews had a 14% chance of surviving their required 25-mission combat tour. The Mustang was supposed to change everything. And it did, for about 90 minutes per mission. Then the coolant froze. The problem was simple physics that Packard's engineers in California had never encountered. The Merlin engine used a liquid cooling system. Ethylene glycol coolant circulated through passages in the engine block, absorbed heat, flowed through a radiator where ram air cooled it, then circulated back through the engine. The system worked flawlessly at sea level. Worked perfectly in California where Packard tested engines. Worked fine in England during ground operations. But at 25,000 feet over Germany, where outside air temperature dropped to -45 degrees Celsius, the coolant mixture that Packard specified froze solid. Packard's standard coolant ratio was 70% water, 30% ethylene glycol. That mixture had a freeze point of -37 degrees Celsius. More than adequate for ground operations. More than adequate for low-altitude flight. Completely inadequate for high-altitude bomber escort where ram air temperatures routinely hit -45 degrees Celsius. The 8-degree margin was the difference between operational aircraft and 720 dead bomber crewmen. The official solution from Packard Motor Company arrived via telegram on October 20, 1943. Reduce high-altitude loiter time. Descend if coolant temperature exceeds 110 degrees Celsius. Maintain altitude no higher than 25,000 feet for extended periods. The telegram was signed by Harrison Webb, Chief Engineer, Packard Aviation Division. The telegram might as well have said, "Surrender air superiority to the Luftwaffe." German fighters attacked from 28,000 to 30,000 feet. Bf 109Gs had a service ceiling of 39,000 feet. Feather 190A could reach 37,000 feet. Both aircraft could dive on bomber formations from above, build speed, make attack runs, and climb back to altitude before American fighters could intercept. If Mustangs had to stay at 25,000 feet or below, they were worse than useless. They gave bomber crews false confidence while providing no actual protection. But someone at 8th Air Force Headquarters decided Packard's recommendation was acceptable. On October 23, 1943, Fighter Command issued tactical guidance to all P-51 squadrons. Maintain bomber escort altitude at 24,000 to 26,000 feet. Avoid extended operations above 27,000 feet. If coolant temperature exceeds 110 degrees Celsius, descend immediately to 20,000 feet until temperature stabilizes. The guidance killed pilots and bomber crews with equal efficiency. Technical Sergeant Frank Maroney read that guidance on October 24 and wanted to punch someone, preferably Harrison Webb, possibly whoever wrote the tactical guidance. Definitely anyone who thought telling fighters to fly low was an acceptable solution. Maroney was 31 years old, Detroit, Michigan, former automotive mechanic who'd worked at Packard Motor Company from 1939 to 1942. He knew the Merlin engine inside and out, knew it better than most Packard engineers because he'd actually built them, assembled cylinder heads, installed coolant pumps, torqued head bolts to specification. He'd worked on the assembly line where V-1650 engines went from parts to finished units. He understood every system, every tolerance, every specification. He'd enlisted in March 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Army Air Force wanted experienced mechanics. Maroney wanted to do something that mattered. They sent him to aircraft mechanic school at Chanute Field, Illinois. 6 months of training on systems he already understood. He finished top of his class, got promoted to staff sergeant, received orders to the European theatre. He arrived at RAF Duxford in August 1943, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The group had just received their first P-51Bs. Maroney was assigned as crew chief for 4 aircraft, supervising 3 junior mechanics, responsible for keeping Mustangs flying. It was the best job he'd ever had, working on the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, keeping pilots alive, making sure American bombers had protection. It mattered. Then pilots started dying. The first loss was Lieutenant David Morrison, October 8, 1943. Morrison was flying escort for a raid on Bremen, 26,000. feet. 90 minutes into the mission, coolant temperature spiked. Morrison radioed that he was descending. He made it to 18,000 feet before his engine seized. Tried to restart. Couldn't. Headed for the English Channel, hoping to make it to the coast. He didn't. Morrison ditched 15 miles off the Dutch coast. Last radio call said he was in the water. Air-sea rescue searched for 6 hours. Found debris. Never found Morrison's body. Moroney examined Morrison's engine after they recovered the aircraft from the channel. The Royal Navy had pulled the wreckage from 40 feet of water. Salt water had contaminated everything, but Moroney could still see the damage. Ice crystals in the coolant passages, frozen glycol that had expanded, cracked cylinder head passages, blocked coolant flow. The engine had seized because coolant couldn't circulate. Morrison had died because water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, and 30% ethylene glycol wasn't enough to prevent ice formation at 45 below. The second loss was Captain William Hayes, October 19th. Hayes was more experienced than Morrison. 280 combat hours, 14 confirmed kills. He knew how to handle emergency situations. When his coolant temperature spiked at 28,000 feet over Kassel, Hayes didn't panic. He started a controlled descent, reducing throttle, trying to cool the engine gradually. But ice doesn't melt gradually at altitude. It melts when ambient temperature rises above freezing. Hayes descended through 25,000 feet when his engine seized. He was still over Germany. He bailed out. German troops captured him 3 hours later. Hayes spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 3. The third incident was Lieutenant James Harwood, October 23rd. Harwood got lucky. His coolant temperature spiked at 27,000 feet, but he was only 40 miles inside Germany. He dove immediately, made it to 20,000 feet before engine temperature became critical. Coolant thawed. Engine kept running. Harwood aborted the mission, flew home alone, landed at Duxford with an operational aircraft. But the bomber formation he'd been escorting lost 6 B-17 seconds to fighter attacks that happened the moment Harwood disappeared. Harwood found Moroney in the maintenance hangar that evening. Moroney was working on Harwood's aircraft, checking the coolant system. Everything looked normal. Coolant level correct. No leaks. Pump functioning. Radiator clean. Nothing wrong with the aircraft. The problem wasn't mechanical failure. The problem was physics. Harwood watched Moroney work for 5 minutes before speaking. They're going to keep sending us up there, and we're going to keep having to dive. And bomber crews are going to keep dying because we can't stay where we need to be. Moroney didn't look up from the coolant header tank he was inspecting. I know. Can you fix it? Not within regulations. Can you fix it outside? Regulations? That's when Moroney looked up. Harwood was serious. Tired, frustrated, and serious. Moroney could see it in his eyes. Harwood had abandoned bombers to save his own aircraft. He'd followed orders, done everything correctly, and men had died anyway. That kind of thing changes a pilot. Moroney made a decision. Maybe. Give me 2 days. That night, Moroney sat in his quarters and did math. The maintenance manual specified coolant mixture ratios: 70% water, 30% ethylene glycol, freeze point minus 37 degrees Celsius. But ethylene glycol in higher concentrations had different properties. Moroney had worked with coolant systems at Packard, knew the specifications by heart. 60% ethylene glycol, 40% water gave a freeze point of minus 51 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees colder than the current mixture. Adequate for operations at 30,000 feet, where RAM air temperatures bottomed out at minus 47 degrees Celsius, but higher glycol concentration created problems. Ethylene glycol had lower specific heat capacity than water. Water could absorb 4.18 joules per gram per degree Celsius. Ethylene glycol absorbed only 2.4 joules per gram per degree Celsius. Changing from 30% to 60% glycol meant the coolant mixture would absorb approximately 38% less heat. Less heat absorption meant higher engine temperatures during operations. potentially dangerous temperatures during ground operations, or low-altitude combat, where cooling was already marginal. Moroni calculated the Merlin's cooling requirements. Maximum heat rejection at full power, approximately 180 kilowatts. Standard coolant flow rate, 90 liters per minute. Heat capacity of 70-30 mixture, 3.8 joules per gram per degree Celsius. Heat capacity of 40-60 mixture, 2.6 joules per gram per degree Celsius. The numbers showed a 38% reduction in cooling efficiency. But Moroni knew something the engineers at Packard didn't advertise. The Merlin had cooling margin built into its design. Rolls-Royce engineers designed for worst-case scenarios. Maximum heat rejection at maximum power in tropical conditions at sea level with fouled radiators. That's where the 180 kilowatt figure came from. In actual operations, the Merlin rarely produced more than 85% of maximum heat load. The cooling system could handle 38% reduced efficiency because it had 20% excess capacity. The math worked, barely. But barely was enough. The question wasn't whether it would work. The question was whether Moroni would risk court-martial to prove it. Modifying aircraft systems without authorization was a violation of military regulations. Using non-standard coolant mixtures violated Packard specifications. If something went wrong, if an engine failed because of his modification, Moroni would face charges: destruction of military property, reckless endangerment, possibly manslaughter if a pilot died. But if he did nothing, pilots would keep dying anyway. Morrison was already dead. Hayes was in a POW camp. Harwood had been lucky. The next pilot might not be. Moroni made his decision. Sometimes regulations are wrong. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking rules. Sometimes keeping people alive matters more than following orders. He was going to fix the coolant problem. And he was going to do it whether Packard approved or not. October 27th, 1943, 6:15 p.m. RAF Duxford briefing room. 93 pilots from the 354th Fighter Group sat in folding chairs facing a wall map of Germany. Red lines showed the mission route. Blue circles marked fighter rendezvous points. Black crosses indicated known flak concentrations. The target was Schweinfurt, 450 miles into Germany. Ball-bearing factories that supplied 38% of German ball-bearing production. Destroy those factories and you cripple German tank production, aircraft production, everything that required precision bearings. Colonel James Howard stood at the front of the room with a pointer. Takeoff 0700 hours, November 2nd. 291 B-17 seconds from 5 bomb groups. 48 P-51 seconds providing escort. We'll pick up the bomber stream over Belgium at 0840, stay with them to target and back. Expected German fighter strength is 200 plus. JG-3, JG-26, JG-54. They'll come from altitude, 28,000 to 30,000 feet. They'll hit hard, and they'll hit repeatedly. Our job is to keep them off the bombers. Howard paused, looked at his pilots. Intelligence reports the Germans know about our coolant issues. They're planning high-altitude intercepts specifically to force us down. If we have to descend, bomber losses will be catastrophic. Estimated 30 to 40% casualties if they don't have continuous fighter cover. The room was silent. 30 to 40% meant 87 to 116 B-17 seconds. Each B-17 carried 10 men. 870 to 1,160 bomber crewmen, dead or captured because Mustangs couldn't stay at altitude. Lieutenant James Harwood raised his hand. "Sir, what's the plan for coolant failures?" Howard's expression didn't change. "Follow current tactical guidance. If coolant temperature exceeds 110 degrees Celsius, descend to 20,000 feet. If you have to leave formation, radio your position and rejoin as soon as engine temperature stabilizes." Harwood didn't ask the obvious question. What if every Mustang has to descend? What if the entire fighter escort disappears and leaves the bombers alone? He didn't ask, because everyone knew the answer. Bomber crews die. That's what happens. That's what had been happening since October. The briefing continued for another 40 minutes. Weather forecasts, radio frequencies, emergency procedures, bailout protocols. Then Howard dismissed them. Get some rest, this one's going to be rough. Harwood found Maroney in the maintenance hangar at 2200 hours. Maroney was alone, working on coolant system diagrams spread across a workbench. Technical manuals lay open beside him. Pages of handwritten calculations covered a notepad. Maroney looked up when Harwood approached. You said 2 days. It's been 4. Maroney nodded. I know. I've been doing calculations, making sure I'm right before I do something that might kill you. And I think I can fix it. But it violates every regulation in the book. If I'm wrong, you die, and I go to Leavenworth. If I'm right, I still broke regulations, and I might go to Leavenworth anyway. Harwood pulled up a stool, sat down. Tell me what you're thinking, Maroney explained. Coolant mixture ratios. Freeze points. Heat capacity. Cooling efficiency. The math that showed 60% glycol would prevent freezing at altitude while maintaining adequate engine cooling. The risks involved. The fact that Packard would never approve this modification. The fact that Engineering Command would call it reckless. The fact that it was unauthorized, untested, and potentially dangerous. When Maroney finished, Harwood asked one question. Will it work? The math says yes. That's not what I asked. Will it work? Maroney looked at his calculations. Looked at the technical manuals. Looked at Harwood. Yes. It'll work. But if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, I was going to die anyway. Harwood stood up. Do it. Tonight. I'll test it tomorrow. If it works, we'll modify every bird before the Schweinfurt mission. Maroney checked his watch. 22:15. The mission was in 5 days. If he started tonight, worked through the night, he could have Harwood's aircraft ready for a test flight by morning. But this wasn't a simple oil change. This was modifying the cooling system on a $12,000 fighter aircraft without authorization. This was betting a pilot's life on calculations he'd done in a notebook. You're sure about this? Maroney asked. You're the one who has to be sure. I'm just the guy who flies it. Maroney made his decision. Stood up, closed the technical manuals, picked up his toolkit. Let's go look at your bird. They walked across the darkened flight line to Detroit Miss, Harwood's P-51B. Tail number 4, 3-21792. Maroney opened the engine cowling, pulled out his flashlight, illuminated the Packard Merlin. 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, 1,490 horsepower, beautiful engine, perfectly maintained, about to be modified in ways Packard never intended. The coolant system consisted of several components. Header tank, mounted behind the engine. Coolant pump, driven by the engine. Radiator mounted under the fuselage. Coolant lines running through the airframe. Total system capacity, 12 gallons. Current mixture, 8.4 gallons water, 3.6 gallons ethylene glycol. New mixture would be 4.8 gallons water, 7.2 gallons ethylene glycol. Maroney needed to drain the system completely, flush it with compressed air, then refill with the new mixture. Standard procedure took 90 minutes. But this wasn't standard procedure. This was unauthorized modification performed at night by a sergeant who was violating direct orders. Maroney worked carefully, methodically, checking each step twice. He placed a drain pan under the engine block, opened the petcock valve. Coolant streamed out. Greenish liquid, slightly viscous, sweet chemical smell. Ethylene glycol. Toxic if ingested. Maroney had seen mechanics drink it by mistake, thinking it was water. 2 of them died. He handled it carefully, let it drain completely. Disconnected the coolant lines at the header tank. Used compressed air to blow through the system, forcing out residual coolant. The air hissed through the lines, came out the drain valve carrying droplets of glycol. Maroney kept blowing air until nothing came out. System empty. Now came the critical part, mixing the new coolant. Maroney had requisitioned extra ethylene glycol from supply. Told the supply sergeant he needed it for topping off coolant levels across multiple aircraft. The supply sergeant hadn't questioned it. Why would he? Mechanics requisitioned fluids all the time. Maroney measured precisely. 4 gallons of water from the maintenance hangar tap, added 0.8 of a gallon more, 4.8 gallons total. Then 7.2 gallons of ethylene glycol from 5-gallon cans. He mixed them in a clean drum, stirred thoroughly. The mixture was more viscous than standard coolant. Slightly darker green, higher density. It would flow more slowly through the system, which meant the coolant pump would work slightly harder. But pump capacity had margin. It could handle increased viscosity. Installing the new mixture took 30 minutes. Maroney poured it through the header tank, watching the level rise. 12 gallons exactly. Then he had to bleed air from the system. Started the engine, let it run at idle. Opened bleeder valves at high points in the coolant system. Air bubbled out, coolant flowed in. The Merlin ran smoothly, temperature rising gradually from cold start. 60 degrees Celsius, 70, 80, 90, 100. Normal operating temperature. Maroney let the engine run for 15 minutes, watching temperature gauge, listening to pump noise, checking for leaks. Everything normal, no visible problems. Engine temperature stable at 102 degrees Celsius. Radiator, fan working. Coolant circulating properly. He shut down the engine, closed the cowling, cleaned up his tools, checked his watch. 01:30. 3 hours of work. 3 hours of unauthorized modification. 3 hours of breaking regulations to save lives. Harwood had waited the entire time, sitting on the wing, smoking cigarettes, not saying anything. When Maroney finished, Harwood climbed down, looked at the aircraft, looked at Maroney. That's it? That's it. New coolant mixture. 60% glycol. Won't freeze until -51 degrees Celsius. And it won't cook my engine? Math says no. Real-world test says we'll find out tomorrow. Harwood extended his hand. Maroney shook it. Thank you, Frank. Whether this works or not, thank you for trying. They walked back to the barracks. Maroney didn't sleep. Lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, running calculations in his head, checking his math, looking for errors, wondering if he'd just signed Harwood's death warrant. October 28th, 0700 hours. Harwood's test flight. Maroney stood on the flight line, watching Detroit Miss taxi to the runway. Merlin engine. Sounded normal. No unusual noises, no smoke, no obvious problems. Harwood ran up the engine, checked magnetos, cycled the propeller. Standard pre-takeoff checks. Everything normal. Takeoff was smooth. Harwood climbed to 10,000 feet, circled the field. Maroney listened to radio calls. Engine temperature 95 degrees at 10,000 feet. All gauges normal. Climb to 15,000 feet. Engine temp 98 degrees. Coolant pressure normal. 20,000 feet. 100 degrees. Running smooth. 25,000 feet. 102 degrees. No issues. 27,000 feet. This was the test. This was where standard coolant failed. Where ice formed, where pilots died or abandoned their formations. Maroney held his breath, waited for the radio call. Engine temp 104 degrees, holding steady, coolant pressure normal. No fluctuations. Harwood's voice was calm, professional. Frank, I'm going to stay up here for 30 minutes. See if anything changes. Maroney checked his watch. 07:42. 30 minutes would take them to 08:12, 30 minutes at 27,000 feet. 30 minutes in conditions that had killed Morrison, forced Hayes to bail out, made Harwood abort his previous mission. The minutes crawled past. Maroney paced the flight line, smoked 3 cigarettes, watched the sky. Other mechanics noticed, asked what he was doing. Maroney told them he was waiting for a test flight result. Didn't explain what test. Didn't mention unauthorized coolant modifications. 800 hours. Harwood reported engine temperature holding at 104 degrees. No coolant issues. No temperature spikes. System functioning normally. 0810. Still normal. I'm coming down, Frank. Whatever you did, it worked. Harwood landed at 0823, taxied to the maintenance area. Shut down the engine, climbed out of the cockpit grinning. 38 minutes at 27,000 feet. No problems. Engine ran perfectly. Maroney opened the cowling immediately, inspected the engine while it was still hot, checked coolant level, checked for leaks, looked for any signs of overheating, cracking, stress. Found nothing. The engine was fine. The modification worked. Word spread fast. By 0900 hours, Lieutenant Robert Chen found Maroney. Asked if the rumor was true. Asked if Maroney had fixed the coolant problem. Maroney confirmed it. Chen wanted the modification on his aircraft immediately. By noon, 8 pilots had requested modified coolant. By 1800 hours, 12 requests. Maroney couldn't modify 12 aircraft alone. He needed help. Brought in 3 trusted mechanics, showed them the procedure, explained the ratios, told them this was unauthorized but necessary. All 3 agreed without hesitation. They worked 3 nights, October 28th through 30th, modified 12 P-51Bs, 12 aircraft that might survive Schweinfurt, 12 pilots who might stay at altitude, 12 fighters that might protect bombers all the way to target and back. Captain Douglas Price noticed unusual glycol requisitions on October 31st. Called Maroney to his office. Sergeant, supply reports you've requisitioned 48 gallons of ethylene glycol in 3 days. Explain. Maroney had prepared this answer. Some aircraft had contaminated coolant, sir. Had to drain and replace. Mixed with water or debris. Standard maintenance procedure. Price accepted the explanation. Didn't investigate further. Signed off on the requisitions. Maroney walked out of Price's office knowing he'd just lied to a superior officer. Added it to the list of regulations he'd broken. At this point, one more violation didn't matter. November 1st, 1943. 12 P-51Bs at Duxford had modified coolant. 12 aircraft ready for Schweinfurt. The mission was tomorrow. Tomorrow they'd find out if Maroney's math was right. Tomorrow they'd discover if 60% glycol saved lives or killed pilots. Maroney spent that evening in the maintenance hangar, checking each modified aircraft one final time. Harwood found him at 2200 hours. You should get some sleep, Frank. Can't. Need to make sure everything's right. It's right. You know it's right. The test flight proved it. Maroney looked at the 12 Mustangs lined up on the hard stand. 12 aircraft, 12 pilots, hundreds of bomber crewmen depending on those aircraft staying at altitude. If I'm wrong, you're not wrong. Trust your math. Trust your experience. Harwood put his hand on Maroney's shoulder. Tomorrow, we're going to stay at 28,000 feet. We're going to protect those bombers. We're going to come home. Because you fixed what Packard couldn't. Maroney wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe the calculations were correct. The modification would work. Pilots would survive. But believing and knowing are different things. Tomorrow would prove which one mattered. November 2nd, 1943, 0500.30 hours, RAF Duxford briefing room. The same 93 pilots, the same wall map. But the tension was different now. Heavier. Every man in that room knew today's mission would determine whether the 8th Air Force could continue deep penetration raids into Germany. Lose too many bombers and the strategic bombing campaign would collapse. Fail to protect the formations, and crews would refuse to fly. Schweinfurt wasn't just another target. It was a test of whether American air power could survive over Europe. Colonel Howard stood at the map. Weather is clear. Outside air temperature at altitude will be minus 46 degrees Celsius. German fighter strength confirmed at 210 aircraft. They'll attack in waves from altitude. Stay with the bombers. No matter what happens with your aircraft, Stay with the bombers as long as you possibly can. He paused, looked directly at the section, where Harwood sat with 11 other pilots, the 12 who had modified coolant. Howard knew about the modifications. Harwood had told him 2 days ago. Howard's response had been carefully neutral. If it works, I didn't authorize it. If it fails, I never heard about it. Either way, don't tell me the details. The briefing continued. Navigation points, radio frequencies, emergency procedures. Then Howard said something unexpected. Some of you are flying aircraft with non-standard maintenance. I don't know the specifics, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that standard procedures haven't been working. Men have died following regulations. If someone found a better way, I'm not going to court-martial them for initiative. I'm going to pray it works. The room was silent. Every pilot understood what Howard meant. The modifications were officially unsanctioned but unofficially approved. If they worked, no one would ask questions. If they failed, someone would take the blame, probably Maroney. Takeoff was scheduled for 0700 hours. Pilots headed to the mess hall for breakfast. Most couldn't eat. Harwood forced down eggs and coffee. Chen ate nothing. The other 10 pilots picked at their food, waiting for time to pass. Maroney was already at the flight line at 0600 hours. He'd been there since 0430, checking every modified aircraft personally. Coolant levels, pump operation, radiator condition, header tank pressure, everything perfect on all 12 aircraft. He'd done everything he could. Now it was up to physics and prayer. Harwood found him at 0645. How do they look? Good. All systems normal. Coolant mixture stable. No leaks, no contamination. You worried? Maroney didn't lie. Terrified. If I'm wrong, 12 of you die today because I thought I was smarter than Packard's engineers. You are smarter than Packard's engineers. They tested at sea level in California. You tested at 27,000 feet over. England. You know what this engine needs. Harwood climbed into Detroit Miss, began pre-flight checks. See you in 6 hours, Frank. 0700 hours. 48 P-51 Mustangs taxied to the runway. 12 with modified coolant, 36 with standard mixture. The modified aircraft were scattered through the formation. Harwood's section of 4, Chen's section of 4, 4 more divided among other flights. If the modification worked, it would be obvious. If it failed, 12 aircraft would fall from the sky. Takeoff was smooth. 48 fighters climbed to 28,000 feet, formed up over the English Channel, headed toward Belgium. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited. Below them, 291 B-17 seconds climbed to their bombing altitude, 25,000 feet for the bomber stream, 28,000 for the fighter escort, high enough to intercept German fighters diving from above, high enough to kill standard P-51 seconds with coolant failures. 0815. Cross the English Channel. Outside air temperature, minus 38 degrees Celsius. Still above the freeze point for standard coolant. No problems yet. 0840. Enter Belgian airspace. Rendezvous with bomber stream. 291 B-17 seconds in formation. Stacked altitude 24,000 to 26,000 feet. 48 Mustangs above them, weaving back and forth, providing top cover. Temperature dropping. Minus 41 degrees. 090 to 5. First coolant failure. Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 357th Fighter Group. Flying standard coolant mixture. Radio call. Lead, this is Red 4. Engine temp spiking. 115 degrees and climbing. Descending to 20,000. Parker's Mustang dropped out of formation. Dove toward warmer air. Temperature stabilized at 20,000 feet. But he was gone from the escort. 47 Mustangs remaining. 0912. Second failure. Captain Raymond Stone. Same. Problem. Same result. Descended to 18,000 feet. 46 Mustangs. 0918. Lieutenant John Williams. 45 Mustangs. By 09:30, 7 P-51 seconds had abandoned formation due to coolant issues. All 7 had standard Packard coolant mixture. All 7 forced to descend to survive. The escort was losing 15% of its strength before the Germans even appeared. Harwood's section held at 28,000 feet. All 4 aircraft, all modified coolant. Engine temperatures, 100 to 105 degrees Celsius. Stable. No spikes, no ice formation. The modification was working. Chen's section, same result. 4 aircraft at altitude, temperatures normal. Other modified aircraft scattered through the formation, all holding at 28,000 feet. At 09:35, other pilots started noticing. Radio chatter. How is red section staying up here? Blue 3. What's your coolant temp? 104 degrees, stable. How? Mine's already at 112. Harwood keyed his radio. Modified coolant mixture. Talk to Sergeant Maroney when we get home. 09:47. German fighters appeared. 60-plus Bf-109s from Gaggeschwader 3, diving from 30,000 feet. Standard Luftwaffe tactic. Attack from above, use altitude advantage, hit the bombers before American fighters can react. But 12 American Mustangs were exactly where they needed to be. At 28,000 feet, ready to intercept. Harwood's section turned toward the diving Germans. Chen's section followed. 8 modified Mustangs climbing to meet 60 German fighters. The mathematics of air combat are brutal. 8 versus 60 should be a massacre. But the 8 had position, had altitude, had operational aircraft that didn't have to worry about coolant freezing. They had what the other 38 American fighters didn't. Freedom to maneuver at full power without watching engine temperature gauges. Harwood intercepted the lead Bf-109 at 29,000 feet. Head-on pass. Both aircraft firing. The Messerschmitt broke left. Harwood followed, pulled 7 Gs in the turn, engine at full power. Coolant temperature climbed to 108 degrees, normal for combat power, no ice, no spikes, no failures. Chen got the first kill. Bf-109 at 28,500 feet, 3-second burst from 400 yards. 50 caliber rounds walked up the German fighter's fuselage. Engine exploded. Aircraft fell away, trailing black smoke. Gun camera confirmed the kill. The German formation scattered. They'd expected to blow through weak American fighter resistance. Instead, they'd hit 12 Mustangs that fought like demons, Mustangs that stayed at altitude, Mustangs that didn't have to break off engagement because of coolant problems. Second wave. 40 for 190 hours from Gaggeschwader 26. They came in from the side, trying to avoid the high-altitude Mustangs. But modified aircraft were everywhere. 4 more Mustangs at 27,000 feet. 4 at 28,500. They couldn't be everywhere, but they were in enough places that German fighters couldn't get clean runs on the bombers. The fight lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes of continuous combat at 27,000 to 30,000 feet. 23 minutes where coolant temperature mattered as much as pilot skill. Unmodified Mustangs at lower altitude managed 2 kills. Lost 3 aircraft to German fighters who dove on them after escaping the high-altitude defenders. Modified Mustangs claimed 8 kills, 4 probables, 6 damaged. More importantly, they disrupted German attack coordination. Forced German fighters to worry about American interceptors instead of focusing on bombers. Made the Germans fight Mustangs instead of slaughtering B-17 seconds. But at 10:15, Harwood's coolant temperature started, climbing for a different reason. Not from ice. From the opposite problem. Extended combat at full power. Reduced cooling efficiency from high glycol concentration. 105 degrees. 108. 110. This was the trade-off Maroney had predicted. Better freeze protection but reduced heat absorption during sustained high-power operations. 113 degrees. 115. Harwood throttled back slightly, reduced power to 90%, temperature stabilized at 116. Still within acceptable limits. Marginally. Engine could handle 135 degrees before damage became likely. He had 19 degrees of margin. Meanwhile, bomber stream approaching target. 4 minutes out. German fighters regrouping for another attack. Harwood had to choose: maintain full power and risk overheating, or reduce power and give Germans advantage. He chose a third option: maintain position, monitor temperature, accept the risk. 100, 18 degrees, 120. Chen radioed, "Lead, your coolant temp?" 120. "I know." Staying put. 122, 125. Bombers 3 minutes from target. German fighters forming up for final attack run. Harwood held position. 12 modified Mustangs staying at altitude while 7 unmodified aircraft circled below, unable to climb back up, unable to help. 10:19. Bomber stream over target. Lead bombardier released. 784,000 pounds of high explosive fell on Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories. Secondary explosions visible from 28,000 feet. Direct hits on 3 main production facilities. Mission successful. Harwood's temperature peaked at 127 degrees. He immediately reduced throttle to 70%, began gradual descent. Temperature dropped. 123, 118, 110. Engine survived. No permanent damage. The modification worked. But the margin was thinner than Moroni had calculated. Return flight was easier. German fighters had expended ammunition, low on fuel. They harassed the bomber stream but didn't press attacks. Modified Mustangs maintained high cover. 3 more unmodified P-51 seconds had coolant failures during return flight, forced to descend. Total: 10 Mustangs lost escort capability due to standard coolant. 0 modified aircraft lost to coolant issues. Landing at Duxford. 14:35 hours. Mission duration: 6 hours, 53 minutes. 41 Mustangs returned. 7 lost. 5 unmodified aircraft that descended with coolant problems and got picked off by German fighters at low altitude. 2 modified aircraft lost in combat, but not from coolant failures. Shot down by German pilots who got lucky. Bomber losses: 28 B-17 seconds. Significant, but not catastrophic. Pre-mission estimates predicted 40 to 60 losses if fighters couldn't maintain altitude. The modified Mustangs made the difference. 28 losses instead of 50. 220 bomber crewmen killed or missing instead of 500. Mathematics written in blood. Harwood taxied Detroit Miss to the maintenance area. Shut down the engine, climbed out, found Moroni waiting. Harwood's first words: "Your coolant saved my life today. Probably saved 300 bomber crew." Moroni inspected Harwood's engine immediately. Still hot, ticking as metal cooled. Checked coolant level, down 1 quart from evaporation. Checked for leaks, none. Engine had survived 127 degrees without damage. The modification worked. But Moroni noticed something. The temperature had climbed higher than calculations predicted. Higher glycol concentration reduced cooling more than theoretical numbers suggested. Real-world combat conditions were harsher than laboratory tests. The margin was thinner than he'd thought. Adequate, but not comfortable. Other pilots landed. Chen reported peak temperature, 119 degrees. Other modified aircraft, 112 to 124 degrees. All survived. All functional. But 4 aircraft had come within 10 degrees of critical temperature. That was too close. By 1600 hours, Colonel Howard had preliminary mission statistics. He called Moroni to his office at 1800 hours. November 2nd, 1800 hours, Colonel Howard's office. Moroni stood at attention in front of Howard's desk. The colonel held a folder containing mission statistics, maintenance logs, and probably a report about unauthorized coolant modifications. Moroni expected court-martial proceedings, expected charges, expected Leavenworth. Howard looked up from the folder. "Sergeant, Did you modify coolant ratios on 12 aircraft without authorization? Yes, sir. Did you violate Packard engineering specifications? Yes, sir. Did you use non-standard maintenance procedures? Yes, sir. Howard closed the folder, leaned back in his chair. Long silence. Then, how many of your modified aircraft had coolant failures today? 0, sir. How many unmodified aircraft failed? 10, sir. How many modified aircraft maintained altitude throughout the entire mission? 12, sir. All of them. Another silence. Howard stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the flight line where ground crews swarmed over returned Mustangs. I lost 7 aircraft today. 5 of them were shot down after descending with coolant problems. Those pilots followed regulations. They used Packard-approved coolant. They did everything by the book. And they died. He turned back to Maroney. Your pilots broke regulations, used unauthorized modifications, violated every specification in the manual. And they came home. Howard sat back down. I should court-martial you. I should charge you with destruction of government property, unauthorized modification of aircraft systems, and reckless endangerment. But instead, I'm ordering you to modify every P-51 inches this group. Starting tonight, every aircraft gets your coolant mixture. I don't care what Packard says. I don't care what the manual says. I care about pilots coming home alive. Maroney didn't know how to respond. Sir, That's an order, Sergeant. Dismissed. Maroney saluted, turned to leave. Howard stopped him. One more thing. Thank you. You saved a lot of lives today. By 2200 hours, Maroney had assembled every mechanic in the 354th Fighter Group, 32 men in the maintenance hangar. He explained the modification, coolant ratios, freeze points, heat capacity, the risks and benefits, showed them the procedure, demonstrated proper mixing ratios, answered questions. Some mechanics were skeptical. This violates Packard specs. What if something goes wrong? Maroney's response was simple. 10 aircraft failed today using Packard specs. 0 failed using my specs. You want to follow the book, or you want pilots to survive? They worked through the night. 32 mechanics, 36 aircraft. By 0600 hours, November 3rd, every P-51B at Duxford had modified coolant, 48 Mustangs ready for the next mission, 48 aircraft that could stay at altitude, 48 fighters that wouldn't abandon bomber crews because of frozen coolant, but word of the modifications reached higher command. November 3rd, 0900 hours. 3 officers from Army Air Force Engineering Command arrived from London. Captain Douglas Price, who'd rejected Maroney's original report, was with them. They wanted to inspect modified aircraft, wanted to question Maroney, wanted to understand what had happened. Maroney showed them everything, the coolant mixture ratios, the temperature data from Schweinfurt, the fact that 0 modified aircraft failed while 10 unmodified aircraft did. The engineers examined coolant samples, ran tests, measured freeze points, checked heat transfer calculations, interviewed pilots about engine performance. By November 5th, the engineering team concluded Maroney's modification was technically sound. 60% glycol provided freeze protection to minus 51 degrees Celsius. Heat transfer reduction was 38% within Merlin design margins. The modification worked. Their report recommended adoption across all P-51 units in European theatre. Captain Price was notably absent from the final report's author list. He'd been wrong. A sergeant with a wrench had solved a problem that engineers in California couldn't fix. Price requested transfer to another unit. Approved. He left Duxford November 7th. Maroney never saw him again. November 8th, 1943, Wright Field Engineering Division issued Technical Order 01-60JE-194. All P-51B and P-51C aircraft in European theatre to use 40% water, 60% ethylene glycol coolant mixture. Effective immediately. mandatory modification for all units. The technical order included a credit line, based on field modification developed by Technical Sergeant Frank Maroney, 354th Fighter Group. The modification spread rapidly. 8th Air Force. 348 P-51 seconds modified by November 30th. 9th Air Force. 212 aircraft by December 15th. 15th Air Force in Italy. 186 aircraft by January 10th, 1944. By February, Royal Air Force Mustang Mark IIIs received the modification. By March, every Allied Mustang in Europe flew with Maroney's coolant ratio. The statistics proved the modification's value. October 1943. Before modification, 23 P-51 seconds lost to coolant failure. November 1943 through May 1944, after widespread adoption, 4 P-51 seconds lost to coolant issues. 19 aircraft saved, 19 pilots, who came home, and an estimated 800 to 1,200 bomber crewmen who survived because fighter escorts stayed at altitude. Fighter command tracked kill ratios. Modified Mustangs shot down 2.7 German fighters per loss. Unmodified Mustangs, 1.8 per loss. Not because modified aircraft were better fighters, because they could stay where they needed to be, could fight at optimal altitude, could protect bombers instead of diving to save their own engines. German intelligence noticed the change by December 1943. Luftwaffe combat reports mentioned American fighters staying at higher altitude longer, mentioned fewer opportunities to exploit coolant failures. One intercepted German radio message from December 20th. American Mustang pilots have corrected high-altitude cooling deficiency. Adjust intercept tactics accordingly. High-altitude advantage diminished. January 15th, 1944. Maroney received Distinguished Service Cross. Citation read, "For exceptional technical innovation resulting in significant operational advantage and preservation of Allied lives in combat operations against enemy forces." Ceremony at Duxford. Colonel Howard pinned the medal on Maroney's uniform. 48 pilots from 354th Fighter Group attended, every one of them flying aircraft with modified coolant. Maroney was promoted to Master Sergeant, February 1st, received orders to Wright Field Engineering Division as technical consultant. Assignment: develop additional high-altitude modifications for P-51, P-38, P-47 fighters. Maroney left Duxford February 10th, spent the rest of the war in Ohio, working on cooling systems, fuel systems, engine modifications. Never flew combat again. Never needed to. His contribution was already made. April 1944. Packard Motor Company issued revised engineering specification for all Merlin V1000, 650 engines. New standard coolant mixture, 40% water, 60% ethylene glycol for high-altitude applications. The company that had rejected Maroney's insight now made it official policy. The specification included no mention of Maroney. Corporate lawyers had removed his name. But pilots knew. Mechanics knew. Everyone who flew Mustangs knew that a Detroit sergeant had fixed what Packard couldn't. May 8, 1945, war in Europe ended. Maroney returned to Detroit, June 19th. Packard offered him a job. Lead engineer, Cooling Systems Division. Salary: $3,800 per year. Maroney declined. He'd had enough of corporate engineering, enough of people who valued specifications over results. He wanted to work with his hands again, wanted to fix things directly. He opened Maroney's garage in 1948. Small shop on Michigan Avenue. Automotive repair, engine rebuilding, custom cooling systems. Word spread that the owner was the guy who'd fixed the Mustang coolant problem. Pilots came from across the country to have Maroney work on their cars. He never advertised it, never promoted his wartime service, just did good work and let reputation speak for itself. 1967, Society of Automotive Engineers honored Maroney with their Lifetime Achievement Award. recognition for contributions to high-performance cooling systems in automotive and aviation applications. Maroney attended the ceremony in Detroit, gave a 3-minute acceptance speech. Engineering isn't about following specifications, it's about solving problems. Sometimes the book is wrong. Trust your math, trust your experience. And always remember, every system you design, someone's life depends on it. Those 3 sentences became famous in engineering schools, printed on posters, quoted in textbooks, used to teach young engineers that innovation sometimes requires breaking rules, that saving lives matters more than following procedures, that sergeants with wrenches sometimes know more than engineers with degrees. Frank Maroney died February 14, 1991, age 78. Detroit Free Press obituary. Local mechanic, World War II veteran, developed critical aircraft modification that saved hundreds of lives. His funeral drew 14 former P-51 pilots, men from California, Texas, Florida, Oregon, men who'd flown over Germany with modified coolant, men who'd stayed at 28,000 feet when they should have descended, men who'd come home because coolant didn't freeze at minus 46 degrees. Lieutenant James Harwood, retired, age 72, gave the eulogy. Frank Maroney saved my life, November 2, 1943. Saved it by ignoring regulations, trusting mathematics, and having the courage to do what was right instead of what was authorized. He wasn't a hero because he won medals. He was a hero because he understood that specifications exist to serve one purpose, keeping people alive. When specifications fail, that purpose, you change the specifications. Frank changed the specifications, and 800 men went home to their families because one mechanic knew thermodynamics. National Museum of the United States Air Force, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. Display Hall 3. P-51B Mustang, Detroit, Miss. Fully restored. Placard beside the aircraft. This P-51 Mustang flew with modified coolant mixture developed by Technical Sergeant Frank Maroney, 354th Fighter Group, 1943. Maroney's unauthorized field modification solved high-altitude cooling failures, became standard procedure for all Allied Mustangs, and saved an estimated 800 to 1,200 lives during World War II combat operations. Below the placard, a smaller sign, Maroney's modification changed coolant ratio from 70% water, 30% ethylene glycol to 40% water, 60% ethylene glycol. Freeze point dropped from minus 37 degrees Celsius to minus 51 degrees Celsius. Simple change. Enormous impact. Every day, thousands of people walk past that display. Most read the placard, look at the aircraft, move on. But some stop. Some understand. Some realize that the biggest innovations in warfare don't come from generals or scientists. They come from sergeants who see problems and fix them, from mechanics who trust mathematics over manuals, from men who understand that regulations matter less than results. Frank Maroney fixed what Packard couldn't. Saved lives that regulations would have lost. Changed doctrine that experience proved wrong. Not because he was special, because he knew that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking every rule in the book. If this story moved you, like this video. Subscribe for more untold histories from World War II. Real people, real innovation, real heroism. Comment below. Where are you watching from? These men deserve our memory. You're giving them exactly that. Thank you.